Chapter 16 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. Relates what became of Oliver Twist after he had been claimed by Nancy. The narrow streets and courts at length terminated in a large open space, scattered about which were pens for beasts, and other indications of a cattle market. Sikes slackened his pace when they reached this spot, the girl being quite unable to support any longer the rapid rate at which they had hitherto walked. Turning to Oliver, he roughly commanded him to take hold of Nancy's hand. "Do you hear?" growled Sikes, as Oliver hesitated and looked round. They were in a dark corner, quite out of the track of passengers. Oliver saw but too plainly that resistance would be of no avail. He held out his hand, which Nancy clasped tight in hers. "Give me the other," said Sikes, seizing Oliver's unoccupied hand. "Here, bull's-eye." The dog looked up and growled. "See here, boy," said Sikes, putting the other hand to Oliver's throat. "If he speaks ever so soft a word, hold him, do you mind?" The dog growled again, and licking his lips, eyed Oliver as if he were anxious to attach himself to his windpipe without delay. "He's as willing as a Christian, strike me blind if he ain't," said Sikes, regarding the animal with a kind of grim and ferocious approval. "Now, you know what you've got to expect, master, so call away as quick as you like. The dog'll soon stop that game. Get on, young un." Bull's-eye wagged his tail in acknowledgment of this unusually endearing form of speech, and, giving vent to another admonitory growl for the benefit of Oliver, led the way onward. It was Smithfield that they were crossing, though it might have been Grosvenor Square for anything Oliver knew to the contrary. The night was dark and foggy. The lights in the shops could scarcely struggle through the heavy mists, which thickened every moment and shrouded the streets and houses in gloom, rendering the strange place still stranger in Oliver's eyes, and making his uncertainty the more dismal and depressing. They had hurried on a few paces when a deep church bell struck the hour. With its first stroke his two conductors stopped, and turned their heads in the direction whence the sound proceeded. "8 o'clock, Bill," said Nancy when the bell ceased. "What's the good of telling me that? I can hear it, can't I?" replied Sikes. "I wonder whether they can hear it," said Nancy. "Of course they can," replied Sikes. "It was Bartlemy time when I was shopped, and there weren't a penny trumpet in the fair as I couldn't hear the squeaking on. After I was locked up for the night, the row and din outside made the thundering old jail so silent that I could almost have beat my brains out against the iron plates of the door." "Poor fellows," said Nancy, who still had her face turned towards the quarter in which the bell had sounded. "Oh, Bill, such fine young chaps as them!" "Yes, that's all you women think of," answered Sikes. "Fine young chaps! Well, they're as good as dead, so it don't much matter." With this consolation Mr. Sikes appeared to repress a rising tendency to jealousy, and, clasping Oliver's wrist more firmly, told him to step out again. "Wait a minute," said the girl. "I wouldn't hurry by if it was you that was coming out to be hung the next time 8 o'clock struck, Bill. I'd walk round and round the place till I dropped, if the snow was on the ground and I hadn't a shawl to cover me." "And what good will that do?" inquired the unsentimental Mr. Sikes. "Unless you could pitch over a file and 20 yards of good stout rope, you might as well be walking 50 mile off, or not walking at all for the good it would do me. Come on, don't stand preaching there." The girl burst into a laugh, drew her shawl more closely round her, and they walked away. But Oliver felt her hand tremble, and looking up in her face as they passed a gas lamp, saw that it had turned a deadly white. They walked on by little frequented and dirty ways for a full half-hour, and meeting very few people, and those appearing from their looks to hold much the same position in society as Mr. Sikes himself. At length they turned into a very filthy narrow street, nearly full of old clothes shops. The dog, running forward as if conscious that there was no further occasion for its keeping guard, stopped before the door of a shop that was closed and apparently untenanted. The house was in a ruinous condition, and on the door was nailed a board intimating that it was to let, which looked as if it had hung there for many years. "All right," cried Sikes, glancing cautiously about. Nancy stooped below the shutters, and Oliver heard the sound of a bell. They crossed to the opposite side of the street, and stood for a few moments under a lamp. A noise as if a sash window were gently raised was heard, and soon afterwards the door softly opened. Mr. Sikes then seized the terrified boy by the collar with very little ceremony, and all three were quickly inside the house. The passage was perfectly dark. They waited while the person who had let them in chained and barred the door. "Anybody here?" inquired Sikes. "No," replied a voice, which Oliver thought he had heard before. "Is the old un here?" asked the robber. "Yes," replied the voice, "and precious down in the mouth he has been. Won't he be glad to see you? Oh, no!" The style of this reply, as well as the voice which delivered it, seemed familiar to Oliver's ears, but it was impossible to distinguish even the form of the speaker in the darkness. "Let's have a glim," said Sikes, "or we shall go breaking our necks, or treading on the dog, who'll look after your legs if you do." "Stand still a moment, and I'll get you one," replied the voice. The receding footsteps of the speaker were heard, and in another minute the form of Mr. John Dawkins, otherwise the Artful Dodger, appeared. He bore in his right hand a tallow candle stuck in the end of a cleft stick. The young gentleman did not stop to bestow any other remark of recognition upon Oliver than a humorous grin, but turning away beckoned the visitors to follow him down a flight of stairs. They crossed an empty kitchen, and opening the door of a low earthy-smelling room, which seemed to have been built in a small backyard, were received with a shout of laughter. "Oh, my wig, my wig!" cried Master Charlie Bates, from whose lungs the laughter had proceeded. "Here he is! Oh, cry, here he is! Oh, Fagin, look at him! Fagin, do look at him! I can't bear it! It's such a jolly game! I can't bear it! Hold me, somebody, while I laugh it out!" With this irrepressible ebullition of mirth, Master Bates laid himself flat on the floor, and kicked convulsively for 5 minutes in an ecstasy of facetious joy. Then, jumping to his feet, he snatched the cleft stick from the Dodger, and advancing to Oliver, viewed him round and round, while the Jew, taking off his nightcap, made a great number of low bows to the bewildered boy. The Artful, meanwhile, who was of a rather saturnine disposition, and seldom gave way to merriment when it interfered with business, rifled Oliver's pockets with steady assiduity. "Look at his togs, Fagin," said Charlie, putting the light so close to his new jacket as nearly to set him on fire. "Look at his togs! Superfine cloth, and a heavy swell cut. Oh, by eye, what a game! And his books, too. Nothing but a gentleman, Fagin." "Delighted to see you looking so well, my dear," said the Jew, bowing with mock humility. "The Artful shall give you another suit, my dear, for fear you should spoil that Sunday one. Why didn't you write, my dear, and say you were coming? We'd have got something warm for supper." At this Master Bates roared again, so loud that Fagin himself relaxed, and even the Dodger smiled. But as the Artful drew forth the £5 note at that instant, it is doubtful whether the sally of the discovery awakened his merriment. "Hello, what's that?" inquired Sikes, stepping forward as the Jew seized the note. "That's mine, Fagin." "No, no, my dear," said the Jew. "Mine, Bill, mine. You shall have the books." "If that ain't mine," said Bill Sikes, putting on his hat with a determined air, "mine and Nancy's, that is. I'll take the boy back again." The Jew started. Oliver started too, though from a very different cause, for he hoped that the dispute might really end in his being taken back. "Come, hand over, will you?" said Sikes. "This is hardly fair, Bill. Hardly fair, is it, Nancy?" inquired the Jew. "Fair or not fair," retorted Sikes, "hand over, I tell you. Do you think Nancy and me has got nothing else to do with our precious time but to spend it scouting after and kidnapping every young boy as gets grabbed through you? Give it here, you avaricious old skeleton! Give it here!" With this gentle remonstrance, Mr. Sikes plucked the note from between the Jew's finger and thumb, and looking the old man coolly in the face, folded it up small, and tied it in his neckerchief. "That's for our share of the trouble," said Sikes, "and not half enough neither. You may keep the books if you're fond of reading. If you ain't, sell 'em." "They're very pretty," said Charlie Bates, who, with sundry grimaces, had been affecting to read one of the volumes in question. "Beautiful writing, isn't it, Oliver?" At sight of the dismayed look with which Oliver regarded his tormentors, Master Bates, who was blessed with a lively sense of the ludicrous, fell into another ecstasy, more boisterous than the first. "They belong to the old gentleman," said Oliver, wringing his hands, "to the good, kind old gentleman who took me into his house, and had me nursed when I was near dying of the fever. Oh, pray send them back. Send him back his books and money. Keep me here all my life long, but pray, pray send them back. He'll think I stole them. The old lady, all of them who were so kind to me, will think I stole them. Oh, do have mercy upon me and send them back!" With these words, which were uttered with all the energy of passionate grief, Oliver fell upon his knees at the Jew's feet and beat his hands together in perfect desperation. "The boy's right," remarked Fagin, looking covertly round and knitting his shaggy eyebrows into a hard knot. "You're right, Oliver, you're right. They will think you have stolen them," chuckled the Jew, rubbing his hands. "It couldn't have happened better if we had chosen our time." "Course it couldn't," replied Sikes. "I knowed that directly I seed him coming through Clerkenwell with the books under his arm. That's all right enough. They're soft-hearted psalm singers, or they wouldn't have taken him in at all, and they'll ask no questions after him, fear they should be obliged to prosecute and so get him lagged. He's safe enough." Oliver had looked from one to the other while these words were being spoken, as if he were bewildered and could scarcely understand what passed. But when Bill Sikes concluded, he jumped suddenly to his feet and tore wildly from the room, uttering shrieks for help which made the bare old house echo to the roof. "Keep back the dog, Bill!" cried Nancy, springing before the door and closing it, as the Jew and his two pupils darted out in pursuit. "Keep back the dog! He'll tear the boy to pieces!" "Serve him right!" cried Sikes, struggling to disengage himself from the girl's grasp. "Stand off from me, or I'll split your head against the wall." "I don't care for that, Bill, I don't care for that!" screamed the girl, struggling violently with the man. "The child shan't be torn down by the dog unless you kill me first." "Shan't he?" said Sikes, setting his teeth. "I'll soon do that if you don't keep off." The housebreaker flung the girl from him to the further end of the room, just as the Jew and the two boys returned, dragging Oliver among them. "What's the matter here?" said Fagin, looking round. "The girl's gone mad, I think," replied Sikes savagely. "No, she hasn't," said Nancy, pale and breathless from the scuffle. "No, she hasn't, Fagin. Don't think it." "Then keep quiet, will you?" said the Jew, with a threatening look. "No, I won't do that neither," replied Nancy, speaking very loud. "Come, what do you think of that?" Mr. Fagin was sufficiently well acquainted with the manners and customs of that particular species of humanity to which Nancy belonged, to feel tolerably certain that it would be rather unsafe to prolong any conversation with her at present. With the view of diverting the attention of the company, he turned to Oliver. "So you wanted to get away, my dear, did you?" said the Jew, taking up a jagged and knotted club which lay in a corner of the fireplace. "Eh?" Oliver made no reply, but he watched the Jew's motions and breathed quickly. "Wanted to get assistance? Called for the police, did you?" sneered the Jew, catching the boy by the arm. "I'll cure you of that, my young master." The Jew inflicted a smart blow on Oliver's shoulder with the club, and was raising it for a second when the girl, rushing forward, wrested it from his hand. She flung it into the fire with a force that brought some of the glowing coals whirling out into the room. "I won't stand by and see it done, Fagin," cried the girl. "You've got the boy, and what more would you have? Let him be, or I shall put that mark on some of you that will bring me to the gallows before my time." The girl stamped her foot violently on the floor as she vented this threat, and with her lips compressed and her hands clenched, looked alternately at the Jew and the other robber, her face quite colourless from the passion of rage into which she had gradually worked herself. "Why, Nancy," said the Jew in a soothing tone, after a pause during which he and Mr. Sikes had stared at one another in a disconcerted manner, "you're more clever than ever to-night. My dear, you are acting beautifully." "Am I?" said the girl. "Take care I don't overdo it. You'll be the worse for it, Fagin, if I do. And so I tell you in good time to keep clear of me." There is something about a roused woman, especially if she adds to all her other strong passions the fierce impulses of recklessness and despair, which few men like to provoke. The Jew saw that it would be hopeless to effect any further mistake regarding the reality of Miss Nancy's rage, and shrinking involuntarily back a few paces, cast a glance, half imploring and half cowardly, at Sikes, as if to hint that he was the fittest person to pursue the dialogue. Mr. Sikes, thus mutely appealed to, and possibly feeling his personal pride and influence interested in the immediate reduction of Miss Nancy to reason, gave utterance to about a couple of score of curses and threats, the rapid production of which reflected great credit on the fertility of his invention. As they produced no visible effect on the object against whom they were discharged, however, he resorted to more tangible arguments. "What do you mean by this?" said Sikes, backing up the inquiry with a very common imprecation, concerning the most beautiful of human features, which, if it were heard above only once out of every 50,000 times that it is uttered below, would render blindness as common a disorder as measles. "What do you mean by it? Burn my body? Do you know who you are, and what you are?" "Oh, yes, I know all about it," replied the girl, laughing hysterically, and shaking her head from side to side, with a poor assumption of indifference. "Well, then, keep quiet," rejoined Sikes, with a growl like that he was accustomed to use when addressing his dog, "or I'll quiet you for a good long time to come." The girl laughed again, even less composedly than before, and darting a hasty look at Sikes, turned her face aside and bit her lip till the blood came. "You're a nice one," added Sikes, as he surveyed her with a contemptuous air, "to take up the humane and genteel side. A pretty subject for the child, as you call him, to make a friend of." "God Almighty help me, I am!" cried the girl passionately, "and I wish I had been struck dead in the street, or had changed places with them we passed so near to-night, before I had lent a hand in bringing him here. He's a thief, a liar, a devil, all that's bad from this night forth. Isn't that enough for the old wretch without blows?" "Come, come, Sikes," said the Jew, appealing to him in a remonstratory tone, and motioning towards the boys, who were eagerly attentive to all that passed. "We must have civil words. Civil words, Bill." "Civil words!" cried the girl, whose passion was frightful to see. "Civil words, you villain! Yes, you deserve 'em from me. I thieved for you when I was a child not half as old as this," pointing to Oliver. "I have been in the same trade and in the same service for 12 years since. Don't you know it? Speak out. Don't you know it?" "Well, well," replied the Jew, with an attempt at pacification, "and if you have, it's your living." "Aye, it is," returned the girl, not speaking, but pouring out the words in one continuous and vehement scream. "It is my living, and the cold, wet, dirty streets of my home, and you're the wretch that drove me into them long ago, and that'll keep me there day and night, till I die." "I shall do you a mischief," interposed the Jew, goaded by these reproaches, "a mischief worse than that, if you say much more." The girl said nothing more, but tearing her hair and dress in a transport of passion, made such a rush at the Jew as would probably have left signal marks of her revenge upon him, had not her wrists been seized by Sikes at the right moment, upon which she made a few ineffectual struggles and fainted. "She's all right now," said Sikes, laying her down in a corner. "She's uncommon strong in the arms when she's up in this way." The Jew wiped his forehead and smiled, as if it were a relief to have the disturbance over, but neither he, nor Sikes, nor the dog, nor the boys, seemed to consider it in any other light than a common occurrence, incidental to the business. "It's the worst of having to do with women," said the Jew, replacing his club. "But they're clever, and we can't get on in our line without them. Charley, show Oliver to bed." "I suppose he'd better not wear his best clothes to-morrow, Fagin, had he?" inquired Charley Bates. "Certainly not," replied the Jew, reciprocating the grin with which Charley put the question. Master Bates, apparently much delighted with his commission, took the cleft stick and led Oliver to an adjacent kitchen, where there were 2 or 3 beds on which he had slept before, and here, with many uncontrollable bursts of laughter, he produced the identical old suit of clothes which Oliver had so much congratulated himself upon leaving off at Mr. Brownlow's, and the accidental display of which to Fagin by the Jew who purchased them had been the very first clue received of his whereabouts. "Put off the smart ones," said Charley, "and I'll give them to Fagin to take care of. What fun it is!" Poor Oliver unwillingly complied. Master Bates, rolling up the new clothes under his arm, departed from the room, leaving Oliver in the dark, and locking the door behind him. The noise of Charley's laughter, and the voice of Miss Betsy, who opportunely arrived to throw water over her friend, and perform other feminine offices for the promotion of her recovery, might have kept many people awake under more happy circumstances than those in which Oliver was placed. But he was sick and weary, and he soon fell sound asleep. End of chapter 16. Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. Oliver's destiny, continuing unpropitious, brings a great man to London to injure his reputation. It is the custom on the stage, in all good murderous melodramas, to present the tragic and the comic scenes in as regular alternation as the layers of red and white in a side of streaky bacon. The hero sinks upon his straw bed, weighed down by fetters and misfortunes. In the next scene his faithful but unconscious squire regales the audience with a comic song. We behold with throbbing bosoms the heroine in the grasp of a proud and ruthless baron, her virtue and her life alike in danger, drawing forth her dagger to preserve the one at the cost of the other. And just as our expectations are wrought up to the highest pitch, a whistle is heard, and we are straightway transported to the great hall of the castle, where a grey-headed seneschal sings a funny chorus with a funnier body of vassals, who are free of all sorts of places, from church vaults to palaces, and roam about in company carolling perpetually. Such changes appear absurd, but they are not so unnatural as they would seem at first sight. The transitions in real life from well-spread boards to death-beds, and from mourning weeds to holiday garments, are not a whit less startling, only there we are busy actors instead of passive lookers-on, which makes a vast difference. The actors in the mimic life of the theatre are blind to violent transitions and abrupt impulses of passion or feeling, which, presented before the eyes of mere spectators, are at once condemned as outrageous and preposterous. As sudden shiftings of the scene and rapid changes of time and place are not only sanctioned in books by long usage, but are by many considered as the great art of authorship, an author's skill in his craft being by such critics chiefly estimated with relation to the dilemmas in which he leaves his characters at the end of every chapter, this brief introduction to the present one may perhaps be deemed unnecessary. If so, let it be considered a delicate intimation on the part of the historian that he is going back to the town in which Oliver Twist was born, the reader taking it for granted that there are good and substantial reasons for making the journey, or he would not be invited to proceed upon such an expedition. Mr. Bumble emerged at early morning from the workhouse gate, and walked with portly carriage and commanding steps up the High Street. He was in the full bloom and pride of beadlehood. His cocked hat and coat were dazzling in the morning sun. He clutched his cane with the vigorous tenacity of health and power. Mr. Bumble always carried his head high, but this morning it was higher than usual. There was an abstraction in his eye, an elevation in his air, which might have warned an observant stranger that thoughts were passing in the beadle's mind too great for utterance. Mr. Bumble stopped not to converse with the small shopkeepers and others who spoke to him deferentially as he passed along. He merely returned their salutations with a wave of his hand, and relaxed not in his dignified pace until he reached the farm where Mrs. Mann tended the infant paupers with parochial care. "Drat that beadle," said Mrs. Mann, hearing the well-known shaking at the garden gate, "if it isn't him at this time in the morning. Look, Mr. Bumble, only think of its being you. Well, dear me, it is a pleasure, this is. Come into the parlour, sir, please." The first sentence was addressed to Susan, and the exclamations of delight were uttered to Mr. Bumble, as the good lady unlocked the garden gate and showed him, with great attention and respect, into the house. "Mrs. Mann," said Mr. Bumble, not sitting upon or dropping himself into a seat, as any common jackanapes would, but letting himself gradually and slowly down into a chair. "Mrs. Mann, ma'am, good morning." "Well, and good morning to you, sir," replied Mrs. Mann, with many smiles, "and hoping you find yourself well, sir." "So, Mrs. Mann," replied the beadle. "A parochial life is not a bed of roses, Mrs. Mann." "Ah, that it isn't indeed, Mr. Bumble," rejoined the lady, and all the infant paupers might have chorused the rejoinder with great propriety, if they had heard it. "A parochial life, ma'am," continued Mr. Bumble, striking the table with his cane, "is a life of worrit and vexation and hardihood. But all public characters, as I may say, must suffer prosecution." Mrs. Mann, not very well knowing what the beadle meant, raised her hands with a look of sympathy, and sighed. "Ah, you may well sigh, Mrs. Mann," said the beadle. Finding she had done right, Mrs. Mann sighed again, evidently to the satisfaction of the public character, who, repressing a complacent smile by looking sternly at his cocked hat, said, "Mrs. Mann, I am going to London." "Look, Mr. Bumble," cried Mrs. Mann, starting back. "To London, ma'am," resumed the inflexible beadle, "by coach. I and two paupers, Mrs. Mann. A legal action is a-coming on about a settlement, and the board has appointed me, Mrs. Mann, to depose to the matter before the Quarter Sessions at Clerkenwell. And I very much question, added Mr. Bumble, drawing himself up, "whether the Clerkenwell Sessions will not find themselves in the wrong box before they have done with me." "Oh, you mustn't be too hard upon them, sir," said Mrs. Mann coaxingly. "The Clerkenwell Sessions have brought it upon themselves, ma'am," replied Mr. Bumble, "and if the Clerkenwell Sessions find that they come off rather worse than they expected, the Clerkenwell Sessions have only themselves to thank." There was so much determination and depth of purpose about the menacing manner in which Mr. Bumble delivered himself of these words, that Mrs. Mann appeared quite awed by them. At length she said, "You're going by coach, sir? I thought it was always usual to send them paupers in carts." "That's when they're ill, Mrs. Mann," said the beadle. "We put the sick paupers into open carts in the rainy weather, to prevent their taking cold." "Oh," said Mrs. Mann. "The opposition coach contracts for these two, and takes them cheap," said Mr. Bumble. "They are both in a very low state, and we find it would come £2 cheaper to move 'em than to bury 'em, that is, if we can throw 'em upon another parish, which I think we shall be able to do, if they don't die upon the road to spite us." When Mr. Bumble had laughed a little while, his eyes again encountered the cocked hat, and he became grave. "We are forgetting business, ma'am," said the beadle. "Here's your parochial stipend for the month." Mr. Bumble produced some silver money rolled up in paper from his pocket-book, and requested a receipt, which Mrs. Mann wrote. "It's very much blotted, sir," said the farmer of infants, "but it's formal enough, I daresay. Thank you, Mr. Bumble, sir. I'm very much obliged to you, I'm sure." Mr. Bumble nodded blandly in acknowledgment of Mrs. Mann's curtsy, and inquired how the children were. "Bless their dear little hearts," said Mrs. Mann with emotion. "They're as well as can be, the dears, of course, except the two that died last week, and little Dick." "Isn't that boy no better?" inquired Mr. Bumble. Mrs. Mann shook her head. "He's a ill-conditioned, wicious, bad-disposed parochial child, that," said Mr. Bumble angrily. "Where is he?" "I'll bring him to you in 1 minute, sir," replied Mrs. Mann. "Here, you, Dick." After some calling, Dick was discovered. Having had his face put under the pump and dried upon Mrs. Mann's gown, he was led into the awful presence of Mr. Bumble the beadle. The child was pale and thin, his cheeks were sunken, and his eyes large and bright. The scanty parish dress, the livery of his misery, hung loosely on his feeble body, and his young limbs had wasted away like those of an old man. Such was the little being who stood trembling beneath Mr. Bumble's glance, not daring to lift his eyes from the floor, and dreading even to hear the beadle's voice. "Can't you look at the gentleman, you obstinate boy?" said Mrs. Mann. The child meekly raised his eyes and encountered those of Mr. Bumble. "What's the matter with you, parochial Dick?" inquired Mr. Bumble, with well-timed jocularity. "Nothing, sir," said the child faintly. "I should think not," said Mrs. Mann, who had of course laughed very much at Mr. Bumble's humour. "You want for nothing, I'm sure." "I should like—" faltered the child. "Hey day!" interposed Mrs. Mann. "I suppose you're going to say that you do want for something now. Why, you little wretch—" "Stop, Mrs. Mann, stop," said the beadle, raising his hand with a show of authority. "Like what, sir? Eh?" "I should like," faltered the child, "if somebody that can write would put a few words down for me on a piece of paper, and fold it up and seal it, and keep it for me, after I am laid in the ground." "Why, what does the boy mean?" exclaimed Mr. Bumble, on whom the earnest manner and wan aspect of the child had made some impression, accustomed as he was to such things. "What do you mean, sir?" "I should like," said the child, "to leave my dear love to poor Oliver Twist, and to let him know how often I have sat by myself and cried to think of his wandering about in the dark nights, with nobody to help him. And I should like to tell him," said the child, pressing his small hands together, and speaking with great fervour, "that I was glad to die when I was very young, for perhaps if I had lived to be a man and had grown old, my little sister who is in heaven might forget me or be unlike me, and it would be much happier if we were both children there together." Mr. Bumble surveyed the little speaker from head to foot with indescribable astonishment, and turning to his companion said, "They're all in one story, Mrs. Mann. That outdacious Oliver has demodularized them all." "I couldn't have believed it, sir," said Mrs. Mann, holding up her hands and looking malignantly at Dick. "I never see such a hardened little wretch." "Take him away, ma'am," said the beadle imperiously. "This must be stated to the board, Mrs. Mann."
"I hope the gentleman will understand that it isn't my fault, sir," said Mrs. Mann, whimpering pathetically.
"They shall understand that, ma'am. They shall be acquainted with the true state of the case," said Mr. Bumble. "There, take him away. I can't bear the sight on him." Dick was immediately taken away and locked up in the coal cellar. Mr. Bumble shortly afterwards took himself off to prepare for his journey. At 6 o'clock next morning, Mr. Bumble, having exchanged his cocked hat for a round one, and encased his person in a blue greatcoat with a cape to it, took his place on the outside of the coach, accompanied by the criminals whose settlement was disputed, with whom in due course of time he arrived in London. He experienced no other crosses on the way than those which originated in the perverse behaviour of the two paupers, who persisted in shivering and complaining of the cold in a manner which Mr. Bumble declared caused his teeth to chatter in his head, and made him feel quite uncomfortable, although he had a great coat on. Having disposed of these evil-minded persons for the night, Mr. Bumble sat himself down in the house at which the coach stopped, and took a temperate dinner of steaks, oyster-sauce, and porter. Putting a glass of hot gin and water on the chimney-piece, he drew his chair to the fire, and with sundry moral reflections on the too prevalent sin of discontent and complaining, composed himself to read the paper. The very first paragraph upon which Mr. Bumble's eye rested was the following advertisement: 5 guineas reward. Whereas a young boy named Oliver Twist absconded, or was enticed, on Thursday evening last from his home at Pentonville, and has not since been heard of. The above reward will be paid to any person who will give such information as will lead to the discovery of the said Oliver Twist, or tend to throw any light upon his previous history, in which the advertiser is, for many reasons, warmly interested. And then followed a full description of Oliver's dress, person, appearance, and disappearance, with the name and address of Mr. Brownlow at full length. Mr. Bumble opened his eyes, read the advertisement slowly and carefully 3 several times, and in something more than 5 minutes was on his way to Pentonville, having actually in his excitement left the glass of hot gin and water untasted. "Is Mr. Brownlow at home?" inquired Mr. Bumble of the girl who opened the door. To this inquiry the girl returned the not uncommon, but rather evasive reply of, "I don't know. Where do you come from?" Mr. Bumble no sooner uttered Oliver's name in explanation of his errand than Mrs. Bedwin, who had been listening at the parlour door, hastened into the passage in a breathless state. Come in," said the old lady. "I knew we should hear of him. Poor dear, I knew we should. I was certain of it. Bless his heart, I said so all along." Having said this, the worthy old lady hurried back into the parlour again, and seating herself on a sofa, burst into tears. The girl, who was not quite so susceptible, had run upstairs meanwhile, and now returned with a request that Mr. Bumble would follow her immediately, which he did. He was shown into the little back study, where sat Mr. Brownlow and his friend Mr. Grimwig, with decanters and glasses before them. The latter gentleman at once burst into the exclamation, "A beadle! A parish beadle, or I'll eat my head!" "Pray don't interrupt just now," said Mr. Brownlow. "Take a seat, will you?" Mr. Bumble sat himself down, quite confounded by the oddity of Mr. Grimwig's manner. Mr. Brownlow moved the lamp so as to obtain an uninterrupted view of the beadle's countenance, and said with a little impatience, "Now, sir, you come in consequence of having seen the advertisement." "Yes, sir," said Mr. Bumble. "And you are a beadle, are you not?" inquired Mr. Grimwig. "I am a parochial beadle, gentlemen," rejoined Mr. Bumble proudly. "Of course," observed Mr. Grimwig aside to his friend, "I knew he was. A beadle all over." Mr. Brownlow gently shook his head to impose silence on his friend, and resumed, "Do you know where this poor boy is now?" "No more than nobody," replied Mr. Bumble. "Well, what do you know of him?" inquired the old gentleman. "Speak out, my friend, if you have anything to say. What do you know of him?" "You don't happen to know any good of him, do you?" said Mr. Grimwig caustically, after an attentive perusal of Mr. Bumble's features. Mr. Bumble, catching at the inquiry very quickly, shook his head with portentous solemnity. "You see," said Mr. Grimwig, looking triumphantly at Mr. Brownlow. Mr. Brownlow looked apprehensively at Mr. Bumble's pursed-up countenance, and requested him to communicate what he knew regarding Oliver in as few words as possible.
Mr. Bumble put down his hat, unbuttoned his coat, folded his arms, inclined his head in a retrospective manner, and after a few moments' reflection commenced his story. It would be tedious if given in the beadle's words, occupying as it did some 20 minutes in the telling, but the sum and substance of it was that Oliver was a foundling, born of low and vicious parents, that he had from his birth displayed no better qualities than treachery, ingratitude, and malice, that he had terminated his brief career in the place of his birth by making a sanguinary and cowardly attack on an unoffending lad, and running away in the night time from his master's house. In proof of his really being the person he represented himself, Mr. Bumble laid upon the table the papers he had brought to town. Folding his arms again, he then awaited Mr. Brownlow's observations. "I fear it is all too true," said the old gentleman sorrowfully, after looking over the papers. "This is not much for your intelligence, but I would gladly have given you treble the money if it had been favourable to the boy. It is not at all improbable that if Mr. Bumble had been possessed of this information at an earlier period of the interview, he might have imparted a very different colouring to his little history. It was too late to do it now, however, so he shook his head gravely, and pocketing the 5 guineas, withdrew. Mr. Brownlow paced the room to and fro for some minutes, evidently so much disturbed by the beadle's tale that even Mr. Grimwig forbore to vex him further. At length he stopped and rang the bell violently. "Mrs. Bedwin," said Mr. Brownlow, when the housekeeper appeared, "that boy Oliver is an impostor." "It can't be, sir, it cannot be," said the old lady energetically. "I tell you he is," retorted the old gentleman. "What do you mean by can't be? We've just heard a full account of him from his birth, and he has been a thorough-paced little villain all his life." "I never will believe it, sir," replied the old lady firmly. "Never." "You old women never believe anything but quack doctors and lying story-books," growled Mr. Grimwig. "I knew it all along. Why didn't you take my advice in the beginning? You would if you hadn't had a fever, I suppose, eh? He was interesting, wasn't he? Interesting! Bah!" And Mr. Grimwig poked the fire with a flourish. "He was a dear, grateful, gentle child, sir," retorted Mrs. Bedwin indignantly. "I know what children are, sir, and have done these 40 years, and people who can't say the same shouldn't say anything about them. That's my opinion." This was a hard hit at Mr. Grimwig, who was a bachelor. As it extorted nothing from that gentleman but a smile, the old lady tossed her head and smoothed down her apron preparatory to another speech, when she was stopped by Mr. Brownlow. "Silence," said the old gentleman, feigning an anger he was far from feeling. "Never let me hear that boy's name again. I rang to tell you that. Never, never on any pretence, mind. You may leave the room, Mrs. Bedwin. Remember, I am in earnest." There were sad hearts at Mr. Brownlow's that night. Oliver's heart sank within him when he thought of his good friends. It was well for him that he could not know what they had heard, or it might have broken outright. End of chapter 17. Of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. How Oliver passed his time in the improving society of his reputable friends. About noon next day, when the Dodger and Master Bates had gone out to pursue their customary avocations, Mr. Fagin took the opportunity of reading Oliver a long lecture on the crying sin of ingratitude, of which he clearly demonstrated he had been guilty, to no ordinary extent, in wilfully absenting himself from the society of his anxious friends, and still more in endeavouring to escape from them after so much trouble and expense had been incurred in his recovery. Mr. Fagin laid great stress on the fact of his having taken Oliver in, and cherished him when, without his timely aid, he might have perished with hunger, and he related the dismal and affecting history of a young lad whom, in his philanthropy, he had succoured under parallel circumstances, but who, proving unworthy of his confidence, and evincing a desire to communicate with the police, had unfortunately come to be hanged at the Old Bailey one morning. Mr. Fagin did not seek to conceal his share in the catastrophe, but lamented with tears in his eyes that the wrong-headed and treacherous behaviour of the young person in question had rendered it necessary that he should become the victim of certain evidence for the Crown, which, if it were not precisely true, was indispensably necessary for the safety of him, Mr. Fagin, and a few select friends. Mr. Fagin concluded by drawing a rather disagreeable picture of the discomforts of hanging, and with great friendliness and politeness of manner expressed his anxious hopes that he might never be obliged to submit Oliver Twist to that unpleasant operation. Little Oliver's blood ran cold as he listened to the Jew's words, and imperfectly comprehended the dark threats conveyed in them. That it was possible even for justice itself to confound the innocent with the guilty when they were in accidental companionship he already knew, and that deeply laid plans for the destruction of inconveniently knowing or over-communicative persons had been really devised and carried out by the Jew on more occasions than one, he thought by no means unlikely, when he recollected the general nature of the altercations between that gentleman and Mr. Sikes, which seemed to bear reference to some foregone conspiracy of the kind. As he glanced timidly up and met the Jew's searching look, he felt that his pale face and trembling limbs were neither unnoticed nor unrelished by that wary old gentleman. The Jew, smiling hideously, patted Oliver on the head, and said that if he kept himself quiet and applied himself to business, he saw they would be very good friends yet. Then, taking his hat and covering himself with an old patched greatcoat, he went out and locked the room door behind him. And so Oliver remained all that day, and for the greater part of many subsequent days, seeing nobody between early morning and midnight, and left during the long hours to commune with his own thoughts, which, never failing to revert to his kind friends and the opinion they must long ago have formed of him, were sad indeed. After a lapse of a week or so, the Jew left the room door unlocked, and he was at liberty to wander about the house. It was a very dirty place. The rooms upstairs had great high wooden chimney-pieces and large doors, with panelled walls and cornices to the ceiling, which, although they were black with neglect and dust, were ornamented in various ways. From all of these tokens Oliver concluded that a long time ago, before the old Jew was born, it had belonged to better people, and had perhaps been quite gay and handsome, dismal and dreary as it looked now. Spiders had built their webs in the angles of the walls and ceiling, and sometimes when Oliver walked softly into a room, the mice would scamper across the floor and run back terrified to their holes. With these exceptions there was neither sight nor sound of any living thing, and often when it grew dark and he was tired of wandering from room to room, he would crouch in a corner of the passage by the street door to be as near living people as he could, and would remain there listening and counting the hours until the Jew or the boys returned. In all the rooms the mouldering shutters were fast closed. The bars which held them were screwed tight into the wood, the only light which was admitted stealing its way through round holes at the top, which made the rooms more gloomy and filled them with strange shadows. There was a back garret window with rusty bars outside, which had no shutter, and out of this Oliver often gazed with a melancholy face for hours together, but nothing was to be descried from it but a confused and crowded mass of housetops, blackened chimneys, and gable ends. Sometimes, indeed, a grisly head might be seen peering over the parapet wall of a distant house, but it was quickly withdrawn again, and as the window of Oliver's observatory was nailed down and dimmed with the rain and smoke of years, it was as much as he could do to make out the forms of the different objects beyond, without making any attempt to be seen or heard, which he had as much chance of being as if he had lived inside the ball of St. Paul's Cathedral. One afternoon, the Dodger and Master Bates being engaged out that evening, the first-named young gentleman took it into his head to evince some anxiety regarding the decoration of his person. To do him justice, this was by no means an habitual weakness with him, and with this end and aim he condescendingly commanded Oliver to assist him in his toilet straightway. Oliver was but too glad to make himself useful, too happy to have some faces, however bad, to look upon, too desirous to conciliate those about him when he could honestly do so, to throw any objection in the way of this proposal. So he at once expressed his readiness, and kneeling on the floor while the Dodger sat upon the table so that he could take his foot in his lap, he applied himself to a process which Mr. Dawkins designated as japanning his trotter cases. The phrase, rendered into plain English, signifieth cleaning his boots. Whether it was the sense of freedom and independence which a rational animal may be supposed to feel when he sits on a table, in an easy attitude, smoking a pipe, swinging one leg carelessly to and fro, and having his boots cleaned all the time, without even the past trouble of having taken them off, or the prospective misery of putting them on, to disturb his reflections, or whether it was the goodness of the tobacco that soothed the feelings of the Dodger, or the mildness of the beer that mollified his thoughts, he was evidently tinctured for the nonce with a spice of romance and enthusiasm foreign to his general nature. He looked down on Oliver with a thoughtful countenance for a brief space, and then, raising his head and heaving a gentle sigh, said, half in abstraction and half to Master Bates, "What a pity he isn't a prig!" "Ah," said Master Charlie Bates, "he don't know what's good for him." The Dodger sighed again and resumed his pipe, as did Charlie Bates. They both smoked for some seconds in silence. "I suppose you don't even know what a prig is," said the Dodger mournfully. "I think I know that," replied Oliver, looking up. "It's you're one, are you not?" inquired Oliver, checking himself. "I am," replied the Dodger. "I'd scorn to be anything else." Mr. Dawkins gave his hat a ferocious cock after delivering this sentiment, and looked at Master Bates, as if to denote that he would feel obliged by his saying anything to the contrary. "I am," repeated the Dodger. "So's Charlie, so's Fagin, so's Sykes, so's Nancy, so's Bet. So we all are, down to the dog, and he's the downiest one of the lot." "And the least given to preaching," added Charlie Bates. "He wouldn't so much as bark in the witness box for fear of committing himself. No, not if you tied him up in one and left him there without victuals for a fortnight," said the Dodger. "Not a bit of it," observed Charlie. "He's a rum dog. Don't he look fierce at any strange cove that laughs or sings when he's in company?" pursued the Dodger. "Won't he growl at all when he hears a fiddle playing? And don't he hate other dogs as ain't of his breed? Oh, no!" "He's a out-and-out Christian," said Charlie. This was merely intended as a tribute to the animal's abilities, but it was an appropriate remark in another sense if Master Bates had only known it, for there are a good many ladies and gentlemen claiming to be out-and-out Christians, between whom and Mr. Sykes' dog there exist strong and singular points of resemblance. "Well, well," said the Dodger, recurring to the point from which they had strayed, with that mindfulness of his profession which influenced all his proceedings, "this hasn't got anything to do with young Green here." "No more it has," said Charlie. "Why don't you put yourself under Fagin, Oliver?" "And make your fortune out of hand," added the Dodger with a grin. "And so be able to retire on your property and do the genteel, as I mean to, in the very next leap year before that ever comes, and the 42nd Tuesday in Trinity Week," said Charlie Bates. "I don't like it," rejoined Oliver timidly. "I wish they would let me go. I would rather go." "And Fagin would rather not," rejoined Charlie. Oliver knew this too well, but thinking it might be dangerous to express his feelings more openly, he only sighed and went on with his boot cleaning. "Go!" exclaimed the Dodger. "Why, where's your spirit? Don't you take any pride out of yourself? Would you go and be dependent on your friends?" "Oh, blow that!" said Master Bates, drawing 2 or 3 silk handkerchiefs from his pocket, and tossing them into a cupboard. "That's too mean, that is." "I couldn't do it," said the Dodger with an air of haughty disgust. "You can leave your friends, though," said Oliver with a half-smile, "and let them be punished for what you did." "That," rejoined the Dodger with a wave of his pipe, "that was all out of consideration for Fagin, 'cause the traps know that we worked together, and he might have got into trouble if we hadn't made our lucky. That was the move, wasn't it, Charlie?" Master Bates nodded assent, and would have spoken, but the recollection of Oliver's flight came so suddenly upon him that the smoke he was inhaling got entangled with a laugh, and went up into his head and down into his throat, and brought on a fit of coughing and stamping about 5 minutes long. "Look here," said the Dodger, drawing forth a handful of shillings and halfpence. "Here's a jolly life. What's the odds where it comes from? Here, catch hold. There's plenty more where they were took from. You won't you? Oh, you precious flat!" "It's naughty, ain't it, Oliver?" inquired Charlie Bates. "He'll come to be scragged, won't he?" I don't know what that means," replied Oliver. "Something in this way, old feller," said Charlie. As he said it, Master Bates caught up an end of his neckerchief, and holding it erect in the air, dropped his head on his shoulder, and jerked a curious sound through his teeth, thereby indicating, by a lively pantomimic representation, that scragging and hanging were one and the same thing. "That's what it means," said Charlie. "Look how he stares, Jack. I never did see such prime company as that here boy. He'll be the death of me, I know he will." Master Charlie Bates, having laughed heartily again, resumed his pipe with tears in his eyes. "You've been brought up bad," said the Dodger, surveying his boots with much satisfaction when Oliver had polished them. "Fagin will make something of you, though, or you'll be the first he ever had that turned out unprofitable. You'd better begin at once, for you'll come to the trade long before you think of it, and you're only losing time, Oliver." Master Bates backed this advice with sundry moral admonitions of his own, which being exhausted, he and his friend Mr. Dawkins launched into a glowing description of the numerous pleasures incidental to the life they led, interspersed with a variety of hints to Oliver that the best thing he could do would be to secure Fagin's favour without more delay, by the means which they themselves had employed to gain it. "And always put this in your pipe, Nolly," said the Dodger, as the Jew was heard unlocking the door above. "If you don't take fogels and tickers—" "What's the good of talking that way?" interposed Master Bates. "He don't know what you mean." "If you don't take pocket handkerchiefs and watches," said the Dodger, reducing his conversation to the level of Oliver's capacity, "some other cove will, so that the cove that loses 'em will be all the worse. And you'll be all the worse too, and nobody half a ha'p'orth the better, except the chaps what gets them. And you've just as good a right to them as they have." To be sure," said the Jew, who had entered unseen by Oliver. "It all lies in a nutshell, my dear, in a nutshell. Take the Dodger's word for it. He understands the catechism of his trade." The old man rubbed his hands gleefully together as he corroborated the Dodger's reasoning in these terms, and chuckled with delight at his pupil's proficiency. The conversation proceeded no farther at this time, for the Jew had returned home accompanied by Miss Betsy, and a gentleman whom Oliver had never seen before, but who was accosted by the Dodger as Tom Chitling, and who, having lingered on the stairs to exchange a few gallantries with the lady, now made his appearance. Mr. Chitling was older in years than the Dodger, having perhaps numbered 18 winters, but there was a degree of deference in his deportment towards that young gentleman which seemed to indicate that he felt himself conscious of a slight inferiority in points of genius and professional acquirements. He had small twinkling eyes and a pock-marked face, wore a fur cap, a dark corduroy jacket, greasy fustian trousers, and an apron. His wardrobe was, in truth, rather out of repair, but he excused himself to the company by stating that his time was out only an hour before, and that in consequence of having worn the regimentals for 6 weeks past, he had not been able to bestow any attention on his private clothes. Mr. Chitling added, with strong marks of irritation, that the new way of fumigating clothes up yonder was infernal unconstitutional, for it burnt holes in them, and there was no remedy against the county. The same remark he considered to apply to the regulation mode of cutting the hair, which he held to be decidedly unlawful. Mr. Chitling wound up his observations by stating that he had not touched a drop of anything for 42 mortal long hard-working days, and that he wished he might be busted if he weren't as dry as a lime-basket. "Where do you think the gentleman has come from, Oliver?" inquired the Jew with a grin, as the other boys put a bottle of spirits on the table. I don't know, sir," replied Oliver. "Who's that?" inquired Tom Chitling, casting a contemptuous look at Oliver. "A young friend of mine, my dear," replied the Jew. "He's in luck, then," said the young man, with a meaning look at Fagin. "Never mind where I come from, young'un. You'll find your way there soon enough, I'll bet a crown." At this sally the boys laughed. After some more jokes on the same subject, they exchanged a few short whispers with Fagin, and withdrew. After some words apart between the last comer and Fagin, they drew their chairs towards the fire, and the Jew, telling Oliver to come and sit by them, led the conversation to the topics most calculated to interest his hearers. These were the great advantages of the trade, the proficiency of the Dodger, the amiability of Charlie Bates, and the liberality of the Jew himself. At length these subjects displayed signs of being thoroughly exhausted, and Mr. Chitling did the same, for the house of correction becomes fatiguing after a week or two. Miss Betsy accordingly withdrew, and left the party to their repose. From this day Oliver was seldom left alone, but was placed in almost constant communication with the two boys, who played the old game with the Jew every day, whether for their own improvement or Oliver's, Mr. Fagin knew best. At other times the old man would tell them stories of robberies he had committed in his younger days, mixed up with so much that was droll and curious, that Oliver could not help laughing heartily, and showing that he was amused in spite of all his better feelings. In short, the wily old Jew had the boy in his toils. Having prepared his mind by solitude and gloom to prefer any society to the companionship of his own sad thoughts in such a dreary place, he was now slowly instilling into his soul the poison which he hoped would blacken it and change its hue for ever. End of chapter 18.
Of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. In which a notable plan is discussed and determined on. It was a chill, damp, windy night when the Jew, buttoning his greatcoat tight round his shrivelled body, and pulling the collar up over his ears so as completely to obscure the lower part of his face, emerged from his den. He paused on the step as the door was locked and chained behind him, and having listened while the boys made all secure, and until their retreating footsteps were no longer audible, slunk down the street as quickly as he could. The house to which Oliver had been conveyed was in the neighbourhood of Whitechapel. The Jew stopped for an instant at the corner of the street, and glancing suspiciously round, crossed the road and struck off in the direction of Spitalfields. The mud lay thick upon the stones, and a black mist hung over the streets. The rain fell sluggishly down, and everything felt cold and clammy to the touch. It seemed just the night when it befitted such a being as the Jew to be abroad. As he glided stealthily along, creeping beneath the shelter of the walls and doorways, the hideous old man seemed like some loathsome reptile, engendered in the slime and darkness through which he moved, crawling forth by night in search of some rich offal for a meal. He kept on his course through many winding and narrow ways until he reached Bethnal Green. Then, turning suddenly off to the left, he soon became involved in a maze of the mean and dirty streets which abound in that close and densely populated quarter. The Jew was evidently too familiar with the ground he traversed to be at all bewildered, either by the darkness of the night or the intricacies of the way. He hurried through several alleys and streets, and at length turned into one, lighted only by a single lamp at the farther end. At the door of a house in this street he knocked. Having exchanged a few muttered words with the person who opened it, he walked upstairs. A dog growled as he touched the handle of a room door, and a man's voice demanded who was there. "Only me, Bill, only me, my dear," said the Jew, looking in. "Bring your body in, then," said Sikes. "Lie down, you stupid brute. Don't you know the devil when he's got a greatcoat on?" Apparently the dog had been somewhat deceived by Mr. Fagin's outer garment, for as the Jew unbuttoned it and threw it over the back of a chair, he retired to the corner from which he had risen, wagging his tail as he went to show that he was as well satisfied as it was in his nature to be. "Well," said Sikes. "Well, my dear," replied the Jew. "Ah, Nancy." The latter recognition was uttered with just enough embarrassment to imply a doubt of its reception, for Mr. Fagin and his young friend had not met since he had interfered in behalf of Oliver. All doubts upon the subject, if he had any, were speedily removed by the young lady's behaviour. She took her feet off the fender, pushed back her chair, and bade Fagin to draw up his, without saying more about it, for it was a cold night, and no mistake. "It is cold, Nancy dear," said the Jew, as he warmed his skinny hands over the fire. "It seems to go right through one," added the old man, touching his side. "It must be a piercer if it finds its way through your heart," said Mr. Sikes. "Give him something to drink, Nancy. Burn my body, make haste. It's enough to turn a man ill to see his lean old carcass shivering in that way, like a ugly ghost just rose from the grave." Nancy quickly brought a bottle from a cupboard, in which there were many, which, to judge from the diversity of their appearance, were filled with several kinds of liquids. Sikes, pouring out a glass of brandy, bade the Jew drink it off. "Quite enough, quite, thank you, Bill," replied the Jew, putting down the glass after just setting his lips to it. "What, you're afraid of our getting the better of you, are you?" inquired Sikes, setting his eyes on the Jew. "Ugh." With a hoarse grunt of contempt, Mr. Sikes seized the glass, and threw the remainder of its contents into the ashes, as a preparatory ceremony to filling it again for himself, which he did at once. The Jew glanced round the room as his companion tossed down the second glassful,
not in curiosity, for he had seen it often before, but in a restless and suspicious manner habitual to him. It was a meanly furnished apartment, with nothing but the contents of the closet to induce the belief that its occupier was anything but a working man, and with no more suspicious articles displayed to view than 2 or 3 heavy bludgeons which stood in a corner, and a life-preserver that hung over the chimney-piece. "There," said Sikes, smacking his lips. "Now I'm ready." "For business?" inquired the Jew. "For business," replied Sikes. "So say what you got to say." "About the crib at Chertsey, Bill?" said the Jew, drawing his chair forward and speaking in a very low voice. "Yeah, what about it?" inquired Sikes. "Ah, you know what I mean, my dear," said the Jew. "He knows what I mean, Nancy, don't he?" "No, he don't," sneered Mr. Sikes, "or he won't, and that's the same thing. Speak out and call things by their right names. Don't sit there winking and blinking and talking to me in hints, as if you weren't the very first that thought about the robbery. What do you mean?" "Hush, Bill, hush," said the Jew, who had in vain attempted to stop this burst of indignation. "Somebody will hear us, my dear, somebody will hear us." "Let 'em hear," said Sikes. "I don't care." But as Mr. Sikes did care on reflection, he dropped his voice as he said the words, and grew calmer. "There, there," said the Jew coaxingly. "It was only my caution, nothing more. Now, my dear, about that crib at Chertsey. When is it to be done, Bill, eh? When is it to be done? Such plate, my dear, such plate," said the Jew, rubbing his hands, and elevating his eyebrows in a rapture of anticipation. "Not at all," replied Sikes coldly. "Not to be done at all?" echoed the Jew, leaning back in his chair. "No, not at all," rejoined Sikes. "At least, it can't be a put-up job as we expected." "Then it hasn't been properly gone about," said the Jew, turning pale with anger. "Don't tell me." "But I will tell you," retorted Sikes. "Who are you that's not to be told? I tell you that Toby Crackit has been hanging about the place for a fortnight, and he can't get one of the servants in line." "Do you mean to tell me, Bill," said the Jew, softening as the other grew heated, "that neither of the 2 men in the house can be got over?" "Yeah, I do mean to tell you so," replied Sikes. "The old lady has had him these 20 years, and if you were to give him £500 there wouldn't be in it." "Do you mean to say, my dear," remonstrated the Jew, "that the women can't be got over?" "Not a bit of it," replied Sikes. "Not by Flash Toby Crackit?" said the Jew incredulously. "Think what women are, Bill." "No, not even by Flash Toby Crackit," replied Sikes. "He says he's worn sham whiskers and a canary waistcoat the whole blessed time he's been loitering down there, and it's all of no use." "He should have tried mustachios and a pair of military trousers, my dear," said the Jew. "So he did," rejoined Sikes, "and they weren't no more use than the other plant." The Jew looked blank at this information. After ruminating for some minutes, with his chin sunk on his breast, he raised his head and said, with a deep sigh, that if Flash Toby Crackit reported right, he feared the game was up. "And yet," said the old man, dropping his hands on his knees, "it's a sad thing, my dear, to lose so much when we had set our hearts upon it." "So it is," said Mr. Sikes, "worse luck." A long silence ensued, during which the Jew was plunged in deep thought, with his face wrinkled into an expression of villainy perfectly demoniacal. Sikes eyed him furtively from time to time. Nancy, apparently fearful of irritating the housebreaker, sat with her eyes fixed upon the fire, as if she had been deaf to all that passed. "Fagin," said Sikes, abruptly breaking the stillness that prevailed, "is it worth 50 shiners extra if it's safely done from the outside?" "Yes," said the Jew, as suddenly rousing himself. "Is it a bargain?" inquired Sikes. "Yes, my dear, yes," rejoined the Jew, his eyes glistening, and every muscle in his face working with the excitement that the inquiry had awakened. "Then," said Sikes, thrusting aside the Jew's hand with some disdain, "let it come off as soon as you like. Toby and me were over the garden wall the night before last, sounding the panels of the door and shutters. The crib's barred up like a jail at night, but there's one part we can crack safe and softly." "Which is that, Bill?" asked the Jew eagerly. "Why," whispered Sikes, "as you cross the lawn." "Yes," said the Jew, bending his head forward, with his eyes almost starting out of it. "Huh," said Sikes, stopping short as the girl, scarcely moving her head, looked suddenly round and pointed for an instant to the Jew's face. "Never mind which part it is. You can't do it without me, I know. But it's best to be on the safe side when one deals with you." "As you like, my dear, as you like," replied the Jew. "Is there no help wanted but yours and Toby's?" "None," replied Sikes, "except the centre bit and a boy. The first we both got, and the second you must find us." "A boy!" exclaimed the Jew. "Oh, then it's a panel, eh?" "Never mind what it is," replied Sikes. "I want a boy, and he mustn't be a big un. Lord," said Mr. Sikes reflectively, "if I'd only got that young boy of Ned the chimbley sweeper's! He kept him small on purpose, and let him out by the job. But the father gets lagged, and then the Juvenile Delinquent Society comes and takes the boy away from a trade where he's earning money, teaches him to read and write, and in time makes a 'prentice of him. And so they go on," said Mr. Sikes, his wrath rising with the recollection of his wrongs. "And so they go on, and if they've got money enough, which is a providence they haven't, we shouldn't have half a dozen boys left in the whole trade in a year or two." "No more we should," acquiesced the Jew, who had been considering during this speech, and had only caught the last sentence. "Bill." "What now?" inquired Sikes. The Jew nodded his head towards Nancy, who was still gazing at the fire, and intimated by a sign that he would have her told to leave the room. Sikes shrugged his shoulders impatiently, as if he thought the precaution unnecessary, but complied nevertheless by requesting Miss Nancy to fetch him a jug of beer. "You don't want any beer," said Nancy, folding her arms and retaining her seat very composedly. "I tell you I do," replied Sikes. "Nonsense," rejoined the girl coolly. "Go on, Fagin. I know what he's going to say, Bill. He needn't mind me." The Jew still hesitated. Sikes looked from one to the other in some surprise. "Why, you don't mind the old girl, do you, Fagin?" he asked at length. "You've known her long enough to trust her, or the devil's in it. She ain't one to blab, are you, Nancy?" "I should think not," replied the young lady, drawing her chair up to the table and putting her elbows upon it. "No, no, my dear, I know you're not," said the Jew. "But—" and again the old man paused. "But what?" inquired Sikes. "I didn't know whether she might perhaps be out of sorts, you know, my dear, as she was the other night," replied the Jew. At this confession Miss Nancy burst into a loud laugh, and swallowing a glass of brandy, shook her head with an air of defiance, and burst into sundry exclamations of "Keep the game a-going," "Never say die," and the like. These seemed to have the effect of reassuring both gentlemen, for the Jew nodded his head with a satisfied air, and resumed his seat, as did Mr. Sikes likewise. "Now, Fagin," said Nancy with a laugh, "tell Bill at once about Oliver." "Ha, you're a clever one, my dear, the sharpest girl I ever saw," said the Jew, patting her on the neck. "It was about Oliver I was going to speak, sure enough." "What about him?" demanded Sikes. "He's the boy for you, my dear," replied the Jew in a hoarse whisper, laying his finger on the side of his nose and grinning frightfully. "He!" exclaimed Sikes. "Have him, Bill," said Nancy. "I would if I was in your place. He mayn't be so much up as any of the others, but that's not what you want, if it's only to open a door for you. Depend upon it, he's a safe one, Bill." "I know he is," rejoined Fagin. "He's been in good training these last few weeks, and it's time he began to work for his bread. Besides, the others are all too big." "Well, he is just the size I want," said Mr. Sikes, ruminating. "And we'll do everything you want, Bill, my dear," interposed the Jew. "He can't help himself. That is, if you frighten him enough." "Frighten him!" echoed Sikes. "It'll be no sham frightening, mind you. If there's anything queer about him when we once get into the work, in for a penny, in for a pound. You won't see him alive again, Fagin. Think of that before you send him. Mark my words," said the robber, poising a crowbar which he had drawn from under the bedstead. "I've thought of it all," said the Jew with energy. I've had my eye upon him, my dears, close, close. Once let him feel that he is one of us. Once fill his mind with the idea that he has been a thief, and he's ours for life. Oh, it couldn't have come about better." The old man crossed his arms upon his breast, and drawing his head and shoulders into a heap, literally hugged himself for joy. "Ours," said Sikes. "Yours, you mean." "Perhaps I do, my dear," said the Jew with a shrill chuckle. "Mine, if you like, Bill." "And what," said Sikes, scowling fiercely on his agreeable friend, "what makes you take so much pains about one chalk-faced kid, when you know there are 50 boys snoozing about common garden every night, as you might pick and choose from?" "Because they're of no use to me, my dear," replied the Jew with some confusion. "Not worth the taking. Their looks convict 'em when they get into trouble, and I lose 'em all. With this boy, properly managed, my dears, I could do what I couldn't with 20 of them. Besides," said the Jew, recovering his self-possession, "he has us now if he could only give us leg bail again, and he must be in the same boat with us. Never mind how he came there, it's quite enough for my power over him that he was in a robbery. That's all I want. Now, how much better this is than being obliged to put the poor little boy out of the way, which would be dangerous, and we should lose by it besides." "When is it to be done?" asked Nancy, stopping some turbulent exclamation on the part of Mr. Sikes, expressive of the disgust with which he received Fagin's affectation of humanity. "Ah, to be sure," said the Jew. "When is it to be done, Bill?" "I planned with Toby the night after to-morrow," rejoined Sikes in a surly voice, "if he heard nothing from me to the contrary." "Good," said the Jew. "There's no moon." "No," rejoined Sikes. "It's all arranged about bringing off the swag, is it?" asked the Jew. Sikes nodded. "And about—" "Oh, it's all planned," rejoined Sikes, interrupting him. "Never mind particulars. You'd better bring the boy here to-morrow night. I shall get off the stone an hour after daybreak. Then you hold your tongue and keep the melting pot ready, and that's all you have to do." After some discussion, in which all three took an active part, it was decided that Nancy should repair to the Jew's next evening when the night had set in, and bring Oliver away with her, Fagin craftily observing that if he evinced any disinclination to the task, he would be more willing to accompany the girl who had recently interfered in his behalf than anybody else. It was also solemnly arranged that poor Oliver should, for the purposes of the contemplated expedition, be unreservedly consigned to the care and custody of Mr. William Sikes, and further that the said Sikes should deal with him as he thought fit, and should not be held responsible by the Jew for any mischance or evil that might be necessary to visit him, it being understood that, to render the compact in this respect binding, any representations made by Mr. Sikes on his return should be required to be confirmed and corroborated in all important particulars by the testimony of Flash Toby Crackit. These preliminaries adjusted, Mr. Sikes proceeded to drink brandy at a furious rate, and to flourish the crowbar in an alarming manner, yelling forth at the same time most unmusical snatches of song, mingled with wild execrations. At length, in a fit of professional enthusiasm, he insisted upon producing his box of house-breaking tools, which he had no sooner stumbled in with and opened for the purpose of explaining the nature and properties of the various implements it contained, and the particular beauties of their construction, than he fell over the box upon the floor, and went to sleep where he fell. "Good night, Nancy," said the Jew, muffling himself up as before. "Good night." Their eyes met, and the Jew scrutinized her narrowly. There was no flinching about the girl. She was as true and earnest in the matter as Toby Crackit himself could be. The Jew again bade her good night, and bestowing a sly kick upon the prostrate form of Mr. Sikes while her back was turned, groped downstairs. "Always the way," muttered the Jew to himself as he turned homeward. "The worst of these women is, that a very little thing serves to call up some long-forgotten feeling, and the best of them is, that it never lasts. The man against the child for a bag of gold." Beguiling the time with these pleasant reflections, Mr. Fagin wended his way through mud and mire to his gloomy abode, where the Dodger was sitting up impatiently awaiting his return. "Is Oliver abed? I want to speak to him," was his first remark as they descended the stairs. "Hours ago," replied the Dodger, throwing open the door. "Here he is." The boy was lying fast asleep on a rude bed on the floor, so pale with anxiety and sadness, and the closeness of his prison, that he looked like death. Not death as it shows in a shroud and coffin, but in the guise it wears when life has just departed, when a young and gentle spirit has but an instant fled to heaven, and the gross air of the world has not had time to breathe upon the changing dust it hallowed. "Not now," said the Jew, turning softly away. "To-morrow, to-morrow." Chapter 19 Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. Wherein Oliver is delivered over to Mr. William Sikes. When Oliver awoke in the morning, he was a good deal surprised to find that a new pair of shoes, with strong, thick soles, had been placed at his bedside, and that his old shoes had been removed. At first he was pleased with the discovery, hoping that it might be the forerunner of his release. But such thoughts were quickly dispelled on his sitting down to breakfast along with the Jew, who told him, in a tone and manner which increased his alarm, that he was to be taken to the residence of Bill Sikes that night. "To stop there, sir?" asked Oliver anxiously.
"No, no, my dear, not to stop there," replied the Jew. "We wouldn't like to lose you. Don't be afraid, Oliver. You shall come back to us again. We wouldn't be so cruel as to send you away, my dear. Oh, no, no."
The old man, who was stooping over the fire toasting a piece of bread, looked round as he bantered Oliver thus, and chuckled as if to show that he knew he would still be very glad to get away if he could.
"I suppose," said the Jew, fixing his eyes on Oliver, "you want to know what you're going to Bill's for, eh, my dear?"
Oliver coloured involuntarily, to find that the old thief had been reading his thoughts, but boldly said, yes, he did want to know.
"What do you think?"
inquired Fagin, parrying the question.
"Indeed, I don't know, sir," replied Oliver.
"Bah!" said the Jew, turning away with a disappointed countenance from a close perusal of the boy's face.
"Wait till Bill tells you, then."
The Jew seemed much vexed by Oliver's not expressing any greater curiosity on the subject, but the truth is that, although Oliver felt very anxious, he was too much confused by the earnest cunning of Fagin's looks, and his own speculations, to make any further inquiries just then. He had no other opportunity, for the Jew remained very surly and silent till night, when he prepared to go abroad.
"You may burn a candle," said the Jew, putting one upon the table, "and here's a book for you to read till they come to fetch you. Good night."
"Good night," replied Oliver softly.
The Jew walked to the door, looking over his shoulder at the boy as he went. Suddenly stopping, he called him by his name. Oliver looked up. The Jew, pointing to the candle, motioned him to light it. He did so, and as he placed the candlestick upon the table, saw that the Jew was gazing fixedly at him, with lowering and contracted brows, from the dark end of the room.
"Take heed, Oliver, take heed,"
said the old man, shaking his right hand before him in a warning manner.
"He's a rough man, and thinks nothing of blood when his own is up. Whatever falls out, say nothing, and do what he bids you, mind."
Placing a strong emphasis on the last word, he suffered his features gradually to resolve themselves into a ghastly grin, and, nodding his head, left the room. Oliver leaned his head upon his hand when the old man disappeared, and pondered with a trembling heart on the words he had just heard. The more he thought of the Jew's admonition, the more he was at a loss to divine its real purpose and meaning. He could think of no bad object to be attained by sending him to Sikes, which would not be equally well answered by his remaining with Fagin, and after meditating a long time, concluded that he had been selected to perform some ordinary menial offices for the housebreaker, until another boy, better suited for his purpose, could be engaged. He was too well accustomed to suffering, and had suffered too much where he was, to bewail the prospect of change very severely. He remained lost in thought for some minutes, and then, with a heavy sigh, snuffed the candle, and taking up the book which the Jew had left with him, began to read. He turned over the leaves, carelessly at first, but lighting on a passage which attracted his attention, he soon became intent upon the volume. It was a history of the lives and trials of great criminals, and the pages were soiled and thumbed with use. Here he read of dreadful crimes that made the blood run cold, of secret murders that had been committed by the lonely wayside, of bodies hidden from the eye of man in deep pits and wells, which would not keep them down, deep as they were, but had yielded them up at last after many years, and so maddened the murderers with the sight, that in their horror they had confessed their guilt, and yelled for the gibbet to end their agony. Here, too, he read of men who, lying in their beds at dead of night, had been tempted, or so they said, and led on by their own bad thoughts, to such dreadful bloodshed as it made the flesh creep and the limbs quail to think of. The terrible descriptions were so real and vivid that the sallow pages seemed to turn red with gore, and the words upon them to be sounded in his ears as if they were whispered in hollow murmurs by the spirits of the dead. In a paroxysm of fear the boy closed the book and thrust it from him. Then, falling upon his knees, he prayed to heaven to spare him from such deeds, and rather to will that he should die at once than be reserved for crimes so fearful and appalling. By degrees he became more calm, and besought, in a low, broken voice, that he might be rescued from his present dangers, and that if any aid were to be raised up for a poor outcast boy who had never known the love of friends or kindred, it might come to him now, when, desolate and deserted, he stood alone in the midst of wickedness and guilt. He had concluded his prayer, but still remained with his head buried in his hands, when a rustling noise aroused him. "What's that?" he cried, starting up, and catching sight of a figure standing by the door. "Who's there?" "Me, only me," replied a tremulous voice. Oliver raised the candle above his head and looked towards the door. It was Nancy. "Put down the light," said the girl, turning away her head. "It hurts my eyes." Oliver saw that she was very pale, and gently inquired if she were ill. The girl threw herself into a chair with her back towards him, and wrung her hands, but made no reply. "God forgive me!" she cried after a while. "I never thought of this." "Has anything happened?" asked Oliver. "Can I help you? I will if I can. I will indeed." She rocked herself to and fro, caught her throat, and uttering a gurgling sound, gasped for breath. "Nancy," cried Oliver, "what is it?" The girl beat her hands upon her knees and her feet upon the ground, and suddenly stopping, drew her shawl close round her, and shivered with cold. Oliver stirred the fire. Drawing her chair close to it, she sat there for a little time without speaking, but at length she raised her head and looked round. "I don't know what comes over me sometimes," she said, affecting to busy herself in arranging her dress. "It's this damp dirty room, I think. Now, Nolly dear, are you ready?" "Am I to go with you?" asked Oliver. "Yes, I have come from Bill," replied the girl. "You are to go with me." "What for?" asked Oliver, recoiling. "What for?" echoed the girl, raising her eyes and averting them again the moment they encountered the boy's face. "Oh, for no harm." "I don't believe it," said Oliver, who had watched her closely. "Have it your own way," rejoined the girl, affecting to laugh. "For no good, then." Oliver could see that he had some power over the girl's better feelings, and for an instant thought of appealing to her compassion for his helpless state. But then the thought darted across his mind that it was barely 11 o'clock, and that many people were still in the streets, of whom surely some might be found to give credence to his tale. As the reflection occurred to him, he stepped forward, and said somewhat hastily that he was ready. Neither his brief consideration nor its purport was lost on his companion. She eyed him narrowly while he spoke, and cast upon him a look of intelligence which sufficiently showed that she guessed what had been passing in his thoughts. "Hush!" said the girl, stooping over him, and pointing to the door as she looked cautiously round. "You can't help yourself. I've tried hard for you, but all to no purpose. You are edged round and round. If you ever are to get loose from here, this is not the time." Struck by the energy of her manner, Oliver looked up in her face with great surprise. She seemed to speak the truth. Her countenance was white and agitated, and she trembled with very earnestness. "I have saved you from being ill-used once, and I will again, and I do now," continued the girl aloud, "for those who would have fetched you if I had not would have been far more rough than me. I have promised for your being quiet and silent. If you are not, you will only do harm to yourself and to me too, and perhaps be my death. See here, I have borne all this for you already, as true as God sees me show it." She pointed hastily to some livid bruises on her neck and arms, and continued with great rapidity. "Remember this: don't let me suffer more for you just now. If I could help you, I would, but I have not the power. They don't mean to harm you. Whatever they make you do is no fault of yours. Hush! Every word from you is a blow for me. Give me your hand. Make haste, your hand." She caught the hand which Oliver instinctively placed in hers, and blowing out the light, drew him after her up the stairs. The door was opened quickly by some one shrouded in the darkness, and was closed quickly when they had passed out. A hackney cabriolet was in waiting. With the same vehemence with which she exhibited in addressing Oliver, the girl pulled him in with her, and drew the curtains close. The driver wanted no directions, but lashed his horse into full speed without the delay of an instant. The girl still held Oliver fast by the hand, and continued to pour into his ear the warnings and assurances she had already imparted. All was so quick and hurried that he had scarcely time to recollect where he was or how he came there, when the carriage stopped at the house to which the Jew's steps had been directed on the previous evening. For one brief moment Oliver cast a hurried glance along the empty street, and a cry for help hung upon his lips. But the girl's voice was in his ear, beseeching him in such tones of agony to remember her, that he had not the heart to utter it. While he hesitated, the opportunity was gone, and he was already in the house, and the door was shut. "This way," said the girl, releasing her hold for the first time. "Bill."
"Hello," replied Sikes, appearing at the head of the stairs with a candle. "Oh, that's the time of day. Come on."
This was a very strong expression of approbation, an uncommonly hearty welcome from a person of Mr. Sikes' temperament. Nancy, appearing much gratified thereby, saluted him cordially.
"Bullseye's gone on with Tom," observed Sikes, as he lighted them up. "He'd have been in the way."
"That's right," rejoined Nancy.
"So you've got the kid?" said Sikes, when they had all reached the room, closing the door as he spoke.
"Yes, here he is," replied Nancy.
"Did he come quiet?"
inquired Sikes. "Like a lamb," rejoined Nancy.
"I'm glad to hear it," said Sikes, looking grimly at Oliver, "for the sake of his young carcass, as will otherways have suffered for it. Come here, young one, and let me read you a lecture, which is as well got over at once."
Thus addressing his new pupil, Mr. Sikes pulled off Oliver's cap and threw it into a corner, and then, taking him by the shoulder, sat himself down by the table, and stood the boy in front of him.
"Now, first, do you know what this is?"
inquired Sikes, taking up a pocket pistol which lay on the table. Oliver replied in the affirmative.
"Well then, look here," continued Sikes. "This is powder, that there's a bullet, and this is a little bit of old hat for wadding."
Oliver murmured his comprehension of the different bodies referred to, and Mr. Sikes proceeded to load the pistol, with great nicety and deliberation.
"Now it's loaded,"
said Mr. Sikes when he had finished. "Yes, I see it is, sir," replied Oliver.
"Well," said
the robber, grasping Oliver's wrist, and putting the barrel so close to his temple that they touched, at which moment the boy could not repress a start,
"if you speak a word when you're out of doors with me, except when I speak to you, that loading will be in your head without notice. So, if you do make up your mind to speak without leave, say your prayers first."
Having bestowed a scowl upon the object of his warning to increase its effect, Mr. Sikes continued.
"As near as I know, there isn't anybody as would be asking very particular after you, if you was disposed of. So I needn't take this devil and all of trouble to explain matters to you, if it weren't for your own good. Do you hear me?"
"The short and the long of what you mean," said Nancy, speaking very emphatically, and slightly frowning at Oliver as if to bespeak his serious attention to her words, "is, that if you are crossed by him in this job you have on hand, you'll prevent his ever telling tales afterwards by shooting him through the head, and you'll take your chance for swinging for it, as you do for a great many other things in the way of business, every month of your life."
"That's it," observed Mr. Sikes approvingly. "Women can always put things in fewest words, except when it's blowing up, and then they lengthens it out. And now that he's thoroughly up to it, let's have some supper, and get a snooze before starting."
In pursuance of this request, Nancy quickly laid a cloth. Disappearing for a few minutes, she presently returned with a pot of porter and a dish of sheep's heads, which gave occasion to several pleasant witticisms on the part of Mr. Sikes, founded upon the singular coincidence of Jemmy's being a cant name in common to them, and also to an ingenious implement much used in his profession. Indeed, the worthy gentleman, stimulated perhaps by the immediate prospect of being on active service, was in great spirits and good humour, in proof whereof it may be here remarked that he humorously drank all the beer at a draught, and did not utter, on a rough calculation, more than 80 oaths during the whole progress of the meal. Supper being ended, it may be easily conceived that Oliver had no great appetite for it. Mr. Sikes disposed of a couple of glasses of spirits and water, and threw himself on the bed, ordering Nancy, with many imprecations in case of failure, to call him at 5 precisely. Oliver stretched himself in his clothes, by command of the same authority, on a mattress upon the floor, and the girl, mending the fire, sat before it in readiness to rouse them at the appointed time. For a long time Oliver lay awake, thinking it not impossible that Nancy might seek that opportunity of whispering some further advice; but the girl sat brooding over the fire without moving, save now and then to trim the light. Weary with watching and anxiety, he at length fell asleep. When he awoke, the table was covered with tea things, and Sikes was thrusting various articles into the pockets of his greatcoat, which hung over the back of a chair. Nancy was busily engaged in preparing breakfast. It was not yet daylight, for the candle was still burning, and it was quite dark outside. A sharp rain, too, was beating against the window-panes, and the sky looked black and cloudy. "Now then," growled Sikes, as Oliver started up, "5:30. Look sharp, or you'll get no breakfast, for it's late as it is." Oliver was not long in making his toilet. Having taken some breakfast, he replied to a surly inquiry from Sikes by saying that he was quite ready. Nancy, scarcely looking at the boy, threw him a handkerchief to tie round his throat. Sikes gave him a large rough cape to button over his shoulders. Thus attired, he gave his hand to the robber, who, merely pausing to show him with a menacing gesture that he had that same pistol in a side pocket of his greatcoat, clasped it firmly in his, and exchanging a farewell with Nancy, led him away. Oliver turned for an instant when they reached the door, in the hope of meeting a look from the girl; but she had resumed her old seat in front of the fire, and sat perfectly motionless before it. Chapter 20